She dropped to her knees in the dirt, not to beg, but because her legs finally gave out after 12 miles of walking on a boot, held together by nothing but stubbornness. The kitchen door swung open. A man looked down at her, and Sarah Whitmore looked straight back up at him and said, "I came to work your dairy, not to be pitied." The man studied her for one long moment. Then he said the words that would change everything. "I don't need a maid, Miss Whitmore. I need a wife. If this story moves you, subscribe, follow Sarah all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels." The door opened before Sarah could knock a second time. She had been on her feet since before dawn, and her left boot had split clean through at the toe somewhere around the 6th mile, and the sun had been punishing her for the last 4 hours, with the particular cruelty of a Virginia summer that had no interest in mercy. But when the door swung open, and a broad-shouldered woman in a gray dress looked down at her with the expression of someone who had seen every kind of trouble and was not impressed by any of it, Sarah Whitmore straightened her spine and lifted her chin and said nothing about any of that. "My name is Sarah Whitmore," she said. "I'm here about the dairy." The woman Mrs. Brooks Sarah would learn later looked her over the way you look at clouds coming in from the west, deciding what kind of storm. "We ain't hiring," Mrs. Brooks said. "You're losing money every month that building sits empty," Sarah said. "I can fix that. I grew up in a working dairy. My father ran the best operation in this part of the valley for 23 years before—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I know milk. I know cheese. I know what a neglected herd does to a season's profit. And I know your dairy's been shut for at least 2 years because the door's hanging wrong, and the drainage ditch on the east side hasn't been cleared, and the pasture rotation is off. You're not just losing money, ma'am. You're losing ground you won't get back." Mrs. Brooks stared at her. "Wait here," she said, and closed the door. Sarah waited. She stood in the full sun because there was no shade near the kitchen step, and she did not move to find any because she did not want to be hard to locate when someone came back. She looked across the yard at the dairy building door, hanging off true weeds, pushing through the drainage channel, the specific silence of a space that had been given up on, and she thought about what it would take to bring it back. She was still thinking when the door opened again. The man who stood in the frame was not what she expected. He was perhaps 31, lean in the way men go, lean from work rather than want, with brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that moved over her, the way a surveyor moves over land. Precise, unhurried, missing nothing. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had been doing something before Mrs. Brooks came to find him and had not stopped to make himself presentable. Sarah found that reassuring. Men who stop to make themselves presentable before hearing a stranger out are men more concerned with appearances than with information. "Mrs. Brooks says you've come about the dairy," he said. "Yes, sir." "You walked here?" "From Harrow's Creek." Something shifted in his face, quick and controlled. "That's 12 miles. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Carter." "Your boot is split." "Also aware," she said. "I didn't walk 12 miles to discuss my footwear. I walked 12 miles because your dairy is dead, and I know how to bring it back, and because every other avenue available to me has been closed, and because I have nothing left to lose by asking." She held his gaze. "I am not here for charity. I am here to work. There is a difference." Nathaniel Carter looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. Behind him in the dim kitchen, Mrs. Brooks stood very still. In the yard, a horse shifted in the paddock. A crow called once from the oak trees near the dairy building and went quiet. "I don't need another maid," Nathaniel Carter said. And then, with the same flat, direct calm he'd used for everything else, "I need a wife." The silence hit like a door slamming. Sarah stared at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without embarrassment, without any of the social softening that should have accompanied those words from a man who had spoken them to a woman he had known for approximately 4 minutes. "Say that again," she said, very quietly. "I said it clearly enough. You're mocking me." Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. Inside, something had gone white-hot and furious, and she kept it contained because she had not walked 12 miles and stood in the sun with a broken boot to lose her composure at the kitchen door of a man she'd never met. I came here in good faith, Mr. Carter, and I would appreciate— I'm not mocking you, he said. I don't have the time for it. He stepped aside from the doorway. Come in. Mrs. Brooks will get you something to eat, and I'll explain what I mean. Sarah did not move. I don't need food. I need you to explain yourself right now where I'm standing. His jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in the composure. All right, he said. Here then. He crossed his arms. I have a 9-year-old girl in this house who has lost more than any child ought to lose before she turns 10. I have an estate that is functioning at half its capacity because I've been trying to manage it and raise her at the same time, and those two things together are more than one person can do well. I have a dairy that has been sitting empty for 2 years because the last person who ran it left under circumstances I am not going to explain at the kitchen door. And I have had a succession of women come through this house over the past 2 years, some sent by the county, some recommended by neighbors, who looked at Emily and looked at the work and decided that the one was too complicated and the other was too hard. He paused. You walked 12 miles with a broken boot and spent 30 seconds looking at my dairy and told me things about it that my own hands haven't noticed. My niece needs stability. This estate needs management. And everything I've tried to solve those problems separately has made both of them worse. He looked at her steadily. I'm not mocking you, he said again. I'm being direct because I've found that indirectness costs everyone more in the end. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The fury had cooled to something harder and more useful, the particular cold clarity she got when she had enough information to make a decision. No, she said. He blinked. It was small, a fraction of a second, but it was there. No, she said again, and the word felt like finding solid ground after 4 hours on ice. I buried my father 6 weeks ago. I watched the creditors carry out every piece of furniture my mother ever owned. I've been sleeping on a borrowed cot in the minister's back room for 3 weeks because I have nowhere else to go. And if I were the kind of woman who married the first man who asked because she was desperate, she let that land. I wouldn't be worth marrying. I am not going to trade one kind of dependency for another. Not today, not this way. How was quiet? Longer than she expected. Then what, he said carefully, are you proposing? A contract, she said. 5 months. I restore the dairy to full operation. I help manage the household. I work with your niece. At the end of 5 months, if the dairy is profitable and the household is in better order, you pay me the agreed wage and I leave with enough to start over on my own terms. She held his gaze. What you said a moment ago, that's not in the contract. Anything not in the contract is not part of our arrangement. And if I want to revisit the matter at the end of 5 months, then you can bring it up, she said. And I'll still have the right to say no. Nathaniel Carter looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. Then, come inside, Miss Whitmore. We'll write the terms. Mrs. Brooks put soup in front of her without ceremony and refilled the water cup without being asked and said nothing beyond what was necessary, which Sarah appreciated more than she could have said. She was hungry enough that the first 3 spoonfuls required her complete attention, and she gave them that attention without apology, because there was no point pretending otherwise. She had last eaten yesterday morning. She did not mention this. She was halfway through the bowl when Nathaniel Carter came back to the kitchen with a piece of paper and a straight-backed chair, which he set across from her and sat on with the economical precision of a man who did not waste motion. Basic terms, he said, and set the paper between them. She read it. His handwriting was angular and unhurried, every letter formed without flourish. The terms were fair, not generous fare. Housing provided. Meals included. Monthly wage with a bonus at term's end, conditional on the dairy, hitting a specified production threshold, which he'd written out in clear numbers. She read it twice. Then she looked up. The bonus threshold is conservative, she said. You've read it for 2 minutes. I grew up reading dairy ledgers, Mr. Carter. The numbers aren't complicated. She kept her eyes on his. If the herd is in reasonable health and I have the equipment I need, we hit this threshold by month 3. I want a sliding scale higher bonus if we exceed the target. If you're confident in the ceiling you've set, it costs you nothing. If you're not confident in it, I'd like to know why before I put my name on anything. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. not quite the absence of one. He picked up the paper, wrote an addition at the bottom, and passed it back. It was exactly what she would have asked for. "There are additional terms," he said. "Not on the paper." She waited. Emily. The name came out differently than everything else he'd said, quieter, carrying something that the rest of his words had been carefully stripped of. "She's 9. She's been quiet in the way children go quiet when they're trying to work through something they don't have words for yet. I'm not asking you to be her mother. I'm not asking you to perform any particular relationship with her. I'm asking you to be decent to her and let her find her own way to you if she chooses to." "That's not an additional term," Sarah said. "That's basic human decency. Some people need to be told." "I don't." He looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't reckon you do." He stood, returned the chair to the wall, and was almost to the door when she said, "Mr. Carter." He stopped. "What you said at the door," she said. "I need to be clear about something." He turned. "I'm here to work," she said. "On the terms on that paper. What you said earlier that stays outside this arrangement until and unless I choose otherwise. Are we understood?" "We're understood," he said. "Good." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softened, but opened the way a window opens, same frame, more air. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I said what I said because it was true, not because I expected you to agree. I understand the difference between a statement and a demand." A pause. "I hope these 5 months show you that I understand that difference in all things." He left. The kitchen settled back into its ordinary sounds, the fire, the pot, the wind against the window glass. Mrs. Brooks wiped down the table in long, slow strokes. She didn't look up. "He say things like that often?" Sarah asked. "Never," said Mrs. Brooks. "In 15 years. Sarah looked at the contract in her hands. The sliding scale edition was written in the same unhurried hand as everything else, as if he'd known she would ask for it. She folded the paper and set it beside her bowl. "What happened to the woman who ran the dairy before?" she asked. "He said she left under circumstances." Mrs. Brooks was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of thought. "His brother hadn't," she said finally. "That's all I'll say on it." "And the brother? Dead 2 years. She set down the cloth. "Emily's his. Her mother died when the girl was 4. Nathaniel took her in." She met Sarah's eyes for the first time since the meal began. "There are people who would use that against him. Against Emily. You'll learn that soon enough, I reckon." "Who?" Sarah said. Mrs. Brooks picked up the cloth again. "The girl's aunt," she said. "Her mother's sister, Margaret Hale." She paused. "She visits, friendly-like, brings gifts for Emily." Another pause heavier than the ones before. "She knows things about that child's birth that could damage everything Nathaniel has built. And she smiles very nicely while she knows them." The room went still. Sarah looked at the contract, then at the dairy building through the window, dark door hanging wrong, waiting. "I see," she said. The room Mrs. Brooks showed her to was small and clean, east end of the upper floor, with a window that looked over the kitchen garden. Real bed, real mattress, basin and pitcher, a wooden peg for her coat. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and did not move for a full minute. She had come here for a job. She had gotten a job, a contract, a room, a marriage proposal, and a warning about a woman who held secrets like weapons all before supper. She looked at her split boot, turned it over, checked the damage with careful hands. Then she lay back on the bed, still dressed, meaning to rest for a few minutes. She was asleep in 30 seconds. Emily found her the next morning. Sarah was at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and her assessment list. When she heard the footstep in the doorway, deliberate the way a child steps when they are deciding whether to commit to a room or retreat from it. She did not look up immediately. She had learned long ago that looking up too fast startled the ones who were still deciding. "You're the one fixing the dairy," the girl said. "That's the plan," Sarah said, and then she looked up. Emily was small for 9, dark-haired with gray eyes that were her uncle's, exactly the same direct assessing quality, the same careful intelligence behind them. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and studied Sarah the way Sarah had studied the dairy building from across the yard, taking inventory, looking for what was sound and what needed work. "Mrs. Hale says Uncle Nathaniel would get married before he fixed the dairy," Emily said. Sarah set her cup down. "Who is Mrs. Hale?" "My aunt. My mother's sister." Emily stepped into the kitchen without being invited, which Sarah found entirely right. Children who wait for permission to enter rooms have usually been given too many reasons to doubt their welcome. She sat down across the table and looked at Sarah's list. "She visits a lot. More lately." "Does she?" "She wants to marry him." Said plainly the way children state facts they have observed and verified and find no reason to dress up. "She doesn't say so, but I can tell. I'm good at knowing what people want when they don't say it." "That's a useful skill," Sarah said. Emily considered this assessment carefully, the way she seemed to consider everything fully before responding. "Daddy said I was like a crow. Said crows notice everything." Something crossed her face then fast and deep, like a shadow across water. "He meant it as a good thing, I think." Sarah looked at the girl, at the thing moving behind her eyes that she was too young to name and too old to not feel. "He did," Sarah said. "And he was right. You'll want that skill. It'll serve you." Emily looked down at the table, then up. The shadow was still there, but something else was there too, tentative, careful, the specific fragile hope of a child who has been disappointed enough times to approach new things slowly. "Will you really fix it?" she said. "The dairy." "Yes." "How do you know you can?" "Because I know what's wrong with it," Sarah said. "And because I said I would. And I don't say things I don't mean to follow through on." Emily studied her, long and serious. "Mrs. Brooks says people always say that," she said. "Some people do," Sarah said. "I happen to mean it." Another long look. Then Emily stood, took a piece of cornbread from the plate on the counter, and moved toward the back door. "There's extra lanterns in the lean-to off the grain barn," she said without turning. "The dairy's dark inside. You'll need 2 at least." "Thank you, Emily." She didn't answer, but her shoulders, Sarah noticed, had released something they'd been holding. Chateau! The dairy was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The equipment was sound. Churns needing scouring, presses needing adjustment, 2 cheese molds cracked and wanting replacement, but the bones were good. The herd was 6 cows thin from a winter of imprecise feeding, but not broken. The floor drain was packed with 2 years of silt. The pasture needed rotation. The east-facing vent was blocked and creating moisture buildup that would destroy the aging shelf if she didn't address it within the week. She wrote it all down. Lists settled her. Lists were things she could act on. Emily trailed her through the inspection at a distance that started at 20 feet, and over the course of the afternoon contracted to about 4. She didn't speak much. She watched everything. At one point, when Sarah crouched to examine the drain and muttered about needing gravel and pitch, Emily said from directly behind her, "There's a gravel pile behind the grain barn, weeds growing through it, but it's there." Sarah stood and looked at her. "Show me." Emily showed her. The gravel was there, half buried under a season's growth, solid underneath. Sarah stood and looked at it and felt the satisfaction of a problem resolving 1 degree, the way problems do when you're paying close enough attention. "Good eye," she said. Emily said nothing, but she stood a little straighter. On the 3rd afternoon, Nathaniel appeared in the dairy doorway while Sarah was on her knees working pitch into the floor drain with a straw brush of her own making. She heard his step and looked up. "Assessment," he said. She sat back on her heels. "Equipment is sound with minor exceptions. I need 2 cheese molds and a 1/4 pound of sealant for the main churn. Herd is workable. You're 2 cows short of optimal, but I'll make do. Drainage is what I'm doing now. East vents blocked, I'll fix it tomorrow. First cheese cycle can start by end of the week." He listened without once interrupting. "The molds and sealant," he said. "Write it down. I'll send someone to town. Already written." She pulled the list from her apron pocket and held it out without getting up. He crossed the dairy and took it. Read it. You've added 2 items that weren't in our original supply discussion. I found them necessary after full inspection. If the additions are a problem, I can work around the aging brush. It'll just cost us a week. The second lantern hook is just safer. 1 lantern in a dairy full of hay and pitch is a fire risk. He looked at the list, then at her. No, I'll have it all sent. He folded the paper, didn't leave. Mrs. Brooks told me Emily came down at 4 in the morning and sat in this kitchen 2 hours talking with you, he said. She had questions about the dairy. She hasn't talked like that in... He stopped, controlled the stop. In some time. She's curious, Sarah said. Curiosity should be fed. I was quiet for a moment, looking at the drain, the brush, the neatly tacked assessment sheet on the wall, taking inventory the same way Emily did, like uncle, like niece. My brother ran this estate for 3 years, he said. Never once got this dairy to function. Different skill sets, Sarah said simply. How was charming, Nathaniel said. And something in the word charming came out with the weight of a man who has spent 2 years cleaning up after what charm undisciplined leaves behind. Sarah looked at him. Charm doesn't move milk. He looked at her. And for a moment, just a moment, something in his face came fully open. Not the almost expression she'd seen before. Something real. Something that had weight and history, and a grief he wasn't going to name at the dairy door. No, he said. It doesn't. He turned to go. Mr. Carter. He stopped. You said at the door that you wanted to apologize, she said, for how you began this. He turned back. Don't, she said. I don't want an apology for directness. I want you to stay direct. She held his gaze. What I do want you to understand is this. I am here to work. I am here to earn. And at the end of 5 months, whatever I've built here, I've built it. Not because I was desperate. Not because I was grateful. Because I was capable. She let that sit. That's the only foundation I'll stand on. Nathaniel Carter looked at her for a long, steady moment. Reckon that's the only foundation worth standing on, he said quietly. He left. Sarah turned back to the drain, worked the pitch in slow, thorough strokes. She was nobody's wife. She was nobody's charity case. And in the mountains of Western Virginia, in the burning summer of 1817, that was the most dangerous and most necessary thing she could be. Friday came with a hard summer rain that turned the yard to mud and made the wagon delivering the new cheese molds from town a spectacle of stuck wheels and sliding curses. Emily watched from the covered porch with her arms crossed over her chest, and when the wheel finally pulled free with a sound like a gunshot and sent mud spraying across the delivery boy's face, she laughed, sudden and real and startled sounding like a laugh that had been waiting for permission. Sarah, standing in the dairy doorway, heard it across the yard. She made a note of it, the way she made notes of everything quietly, precisely in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. Saturday morning. The day was operational. Sarah stood in the center of the clean floor with the first bucket of fresh morning milk and looked at the working churns, the replaced molds, the sealed equipment, the cleared drain, the unblocked vent, the new lantern hook on the east wall. She had done this in 4 days. She heard boots cross the yard, heard them stop at the dairy door, didn't turn. First cycle started, she said. Nathaniel Carter stood in the doorway behind her. She knew without looking that he was reading the room the same way she had read it inventory assessment, what was sound, what had changed. In 4 days, he said. The work was here, she said. Just needed someone to do it. She turned then. I was looking at the dairy, not at her, and in the morning light, his face had a quality she hadn't seen before. Something loosened, something that might have been relief or grief, or the complicated feeling that comes when something you'd given up on comes back alive. Then he looked at her, and what passed between them in that doorway, in the smell of morning milk and pitch and rain-wet Virginia grass, wasn't a word, wasn't a look exactly. It was more like 2 people recognizing something at the same moment and choosing mutually not to say it yet. Not yet. From the porch of the main house in the early morning quiet, Emily Carter stood watching them both. And even at 9 years old, even with the crow-sharp eyes her father had said would serve her, she wasn't sure what she was watching exactly. Only that it was the beginning of something. and that Margaret Hale, who had smiled so nicely at breakfast 2 days ago and said she would be back before month's end, did not know about it yet. And somehow, without being able to say why, Emily thought that mattered. The first cheese wheel came out of the press on a Tuesday, and Sarah knew before she cut into it that it was good, not perfect. The aging would take another 2 weeks, and the texture was slightly coarser than she wanted, a problem she'd traced to the temperature variance in the dairy during the overnight hours, when the fire in the main house burned low and the cold came in under the door. She'd already noted needed weather stripping. But the color was right, the smell was right, and when she pressed her thumb against the rind, it gave back exactly the resistance it should. She set it on the shelf and wrote the date on the paper tag and moved on to the second wheel. Mrs. Brooks appeared in the dairy doorway 20 minutes later with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and set it on the work table without a word and turned to go. "Mrs. Brooks," Sarah said. The housekeeper stopped. "The first wheel is on the top shelf," Sarah said. "Left side. I'd appreciate your opinion when you have a moment." Mrs. Brooks turned back, walked to the shelf, looked at the wheel with the same careful thoroughness she seemed to bring to everything, pressed her own thumb against the rind, leaned in and smelled it. "Your father's recipe," she said. "My mother's," Sarah said. "My father always said she had the better instinct for salt." Mrs. Brooks straightened. Something in her face had shifted, not warmth exactly, but the place just before warmth, where a person decides whether to allow it. "I'll tell Mr. Carter," she said. "I'd rather tell him myself," Sarah said, "when it's ready to sell." A pause. "All right," Mrs. Brooks said, and left. Sarah picked up her coffee and drank it standing up and thought about salt and instinct and the things her mother had known that she was only now beginning to understand. She was 4 days into the second week. The herd was already producing better. She'd adjusted the feeding rotation on day 3, added the clover supplement she'd asked Nathaniel to order from the feed merchant in town, and the difference in the milk volume. The next morning had been significant enough that one of the farmhands, a weathered man of about 50 named Cal, had stopped in the dairy doorway and stared at the full pails with an expression that looked very much like embarrassed respect. "Reckon you know what you're about," he'd said. "Reckon I do," she'd said, and hadn't looked up from the ledger. She'd heard him chuckle as he walked away. It was not an unkind sound. The farmhands had been the first real test. There were 3 of them, Cal, who had been with the estate longest and set the tone for the others. A younger man named Doss, who was strong and willing, and had the habit of doing exactly what he was told, without ever once considering why. And a quiet man of indeterminate age called Wick, who spoke rarely and worked with a consistency that Sarah recognized as the best kind of competence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. On the first day, Cal had asked her politely enough, but with the particular edge that men use when they are checking whether a new authority is real or merely decorative, who was responsible for the pasture rotation schedule. She'd told him she was. He'd asked if she'd spoken with Mr. Carter about it. She'd told him that Mr. Carter had given her full authority over dairy operations, and that the pasture rotation fell within that authority, and if he wanted confirmation, he was welcome to ask Mr. Carter directly, and she'd go on rotating the pasture in the meantime. Cal had looked at her for a moment. Then he'd nodded once and gone to move the herd. She'd heard him say something to Doss that she couldn't quite make out, and Doss had laughed quietly, and after that, the 3 of them had worked with her, rather than alongside her in the waiting, watching way of men, deciding whether to accept a new chain of command. It wasn't exactly warmth, but it was workable. She'd take workable. The harder thing, and the thing she hadn't expected to be harder, was the household. She'd understood going in that her role there was collaborative Mrs. Brooks's territory, Sarah in support. She'd meant to stay carefully within that arrangement. The problem was that the household had inefficiencies that Mrs. Brooks had lived with for so long, she'd stopped seeing them, the way people stop seeing the crack in the ceiling. They pass every morning, and Sarah, who had grown up running a working farm's domestic operations alongside the dairy, saw them immediately and found them difficult to ignore. The supply ordering was the first thing. Mrs. Brooks ordered monthly in bulk, which made sense for staple goods but created waste in perishables, particularly in summer heat. Sarah mentioned it once, carefully framed as a question rather than a correction. Had she ever considered ordering certain items weekly in the warmer months? And Mrs. Brooks had looked at her with an expression that was not quite offense, but was in the neighborhood. "I've run this household for 15 years, Mrs. Brooks said. "I know," Sarah said. "I'm not suggesting otherwise. I was just wondering." Mrs. Brooks had said nothing further. But 2 days later, without comment, the standing order for butter had been adjusted to a weekly delivery of smaller quantities, and the waste in the cold box went down noticeably. Sarah said nothing about it. Some victories were better accepted quietly. Emily was in the dairy every afternoon by the second week. She didn't ask permission. She simply appeared in the way that children claim spaces they feel safe in, and she would find something to do. Straightening tools, checking the water level in the cooling trough, watching Sarah work with the focused attention of someone who is not merely curious, but is actually learning. "Why do you press it twice?" she asked on the Thursday of the second week, watching Sarah work the second cheese wheel through the press. "First press removes the bulk of the moisture," Sarah said. "Second press gets the rest. If you only press once, you get a softer cheese that doesn't age well. If you press too hard too fast, you collapse the structure and the flavor goes flat." Emily considered this. "It's like people," she said. Sarah looked at her. "How do you mean?" "Push too hard too fast, and the good parts go flat." She said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has arrived at this conclusion through experience rather than theory. Sarah looked at the girl for a moment, at the gray eyes that saw things, at the careful way she held herself, at the grief that moved behind her face, like weather behind glass. "That's exactly right," Sarah said. Emily nodded, as if her analysis had been confirmed, and went back to watching. That was the afternoon. Nathaniel came to the dairy and found them both there, Sarah working the press. Emily perched on the stool in the corner with a piece of rope she was braiding for reasons known only to herself, and he stopped in the doorway, the way he sometimes did. Quiet enough that if you weren't listening for it, you might not know he was there. Sarah had learned in 2 weeks to listen for it. "Production report," she said without looking up. "Wheel 2 is in the press. Week's yield is up 30% over what your records show for the last full operating season. I expect another 20% increase once the feeding changes have had another 2 weeks to take effect." "The records from the last operating season weren't complete," Nathaniel said. "I know. I found the gaps. I filled them in with what Cal remembered and what I could reconstruct from the purchase ledgers." She glanced up. "Your brother's record-keeping was approximate." Something crossed his face. "That's a generous description." "I'm practicing generosity," she said. "It doesn't always come naturally." Emily made a sound from her corner that might have been a suppressed laugh. Nathaniel looked at his niece. Something in his expression did what it always did when he looked at Emily, went quieter, more careful, like a man handling something precious that he is afraid of breaking. "You're here again," he said to her. "I'm learning," Emily said. "Mrs. Brooks was looking for you." "I finished the mending," Emily said with the serenity of someone who has anticipated this objection and prepared for it. "And the reading lesson, and I set the table." She looked at her rope. "I'm not needed for another hour." Nathaniel looked at Sarah. "She's useful," Sarah said simply. "Good eye for detail." Emily did not look up from her rope, but she sat a little straighter. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something complicated in the dairy, coming in at an angle through the repaired vent, catching the dust in the air, laying a long stripe across the newly scrubbed floor. Sarah noticed it, the way she noticed everything. Filed it away, went back to the press. "There's a market in Millbrook on Saturday," Nathaniel said. "The regional one draws buyers from 3 counties. If the first wheel is ready..." "It's ready," Sarah said. "I was going to bring it up tonight. I'll take it in." She stopped, looked at him. "I'll take it in." He met her eyes. "It's my dairy operation," she said carefully and without heat. "My product, my sale. That's within the scope of our agreement." "It's a long drive to Millbrook." "I've been to Millbrook before," she said. "My father sold at that market for 20 years. I know the buyers, I know the going rate, and I know which of them will try to pay under rate because they think they can." She held his gaze. "I'll take it in." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cal can drive you. That's fine, she said. He nodded, turned to go. Mr. Carter, Emily said from her corner. He stopped. Aunt Margaret sent the letter, Emily said. She said it without particular emphasis, but her hands had stopped moving on the rope. Mrs. Brooks left it on your desk. She's coming for a visit. End of the month. The room changed. Not in any way that could be precisely described. The light was the same. The sounds from the yard were the same. But something in the quality of the silence shifted, tightened, became the kind of silence that has weight. Nathaniel's face did not change. That Sarah had learned was itself information. Thank you for telling me, he said, and left. Emily stared at her rope. Her hands had not resumed moving. Emily, Sarah said. The girl looked up. When does she usually visit? Every few months, Emily said. She brings me things, books mostly. She knows I like books. A pause. She's not unkind to me. But, Sarah said, because there was clearly a but. Emily was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much to say. She talks about my mother a lot, she said finally. When it's just us. She says things like, your mother would have wanted, and if your mother had lived. Another pause. And then she watches Uncle Nathaniel's face after she says it. Sarah set down the press handle. She looked at the girl very carefully. What do you think she wants? She asked. Emily turned the piece of rope over in her hands. I think she wants him to feel like he owes something, she said. To her. Because of my mother. She looked up at Sarah, and for a moment, the careful 9-year-old composure slipped, and what was underneath was older and more tired than it should have been. I just don't know what she wants him to pay with. Sarah held the girl's gaze. You're going to be all right, you know, she said. Emily looked at her steadily. How do you know? Because you already see the thing most adults take years to learn, Sarah said. What someone wants underneath what they're saying. That's not nothing. That's everything. Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at her rope and began braiding again slowly and with great concentration, as if Sarah had given her something that needed to be carefully held. The Millbrook market was everything Sarah remembered from her father's day, loud, chaotic smelling of horses and livestock and fry bread and ambition, and she moved through it with the particular confidence of someone who knows exactly what they have and exactly what it's worth. Cal drove her in without conversation, which she appreciated. He was a man who understood that silence was sometimes more companionable than talk. She'd brought the first wheel and 6 pounds of fresh butter she'd pressed the day before, packaged in the butter mold she'd found in the back of the dairy's storage shelf, old wooden carved with a thistle pattern that she suspected had some meaning she didn't know yet. The first buyer to approach the wagon was a man named Fletcher, who had a cheese operation 3 miles south of Millbrook, and who had, according to her father's old ledgers, which she'd had the presence of mind to pack before the creditors arrived, a habit of offering 20% under rate and then acting surprised when sellers didn't accept. He looked at the wheel. He looked at her. Widow woman, he said. Miss Whitmore, she said. Sarah Whitmore, Thomas Whitmore's daughter out of Harrow's Creek. I'm running the Carter dairy operation now. Fletcher blinked. Carter. I heard that dairy was shut. It's open, she said. And that wheel is 3 weeks aged, pressed, twice salted to my mother's recipe. You know what Thomas Whitmore's dairy produced. This is better. She met his eyes. The asking price is on the card. He looked at the card, looked at the wheel. Did the thing she'd expected, the practiced wince, the theatrical hesitation? I might be able to do. The asking price is on the card, she said again. Pleasantly, firmly, with the specific tone that ends negotiation downward and opens it only upward. He bought it at asking price. The butter was gone in 20 minutes to a woman who ran a boarding house in Millbrook, who tasted a corner and said simply, Who taught you to make this? My mother, Sarah said. The woman bought everything Sarah had brought and asked if she could arrange a standing weekly order. Sarah rode home in Cal's wagon with an empty crate, a full purse, and the first real feeling she'd had in months. That was not merely the absence of despair, but was its own distinct thing, forward motion, the feeling of a life building rather than dissolving. Cal drove without comment for 4 miles. Then he said, "Your daddy would have been proud of that." "You knew him," Sarah said. "Knew of him," Cal said. "The way Mr. Carter knew of him. Your daddy's dairy had a reputation from here to Staunton." He paused. "Reckon you've got his hands." She looked at her hands in her lap. The calluses. The stains from the pitch and the press. Her father's hands, she thought. He'd been right. She looked at the road ahead and said nothing more, and Cal said nothing more, and the silence between them on that drive home was the comfortable kind, the kind that has been earned. She was writing up the sales record when Nathaniel knocked at the dairy door that evening. She knew it was him by the knock, too firm, even raps no more. She'd already cataloged the knocks of everyone on the property. Cal was 3 heavy. Doss was a single loud bang. Wick scratched rather than knocked, barely audible. Emily didn't knock at all, which Sarah had decided to consider a compliment. "Come in," she said. He came in, looked at the ledger, looked at her. She turned the book toward him without ceremony. He picked it up, read the figures, put the book down. "That's—" He stopped. "That's more than the dairy produced in any single market day in the last full operating season." "I know," she said. "I told you the threshold was conservative." He looked at her. "The boarding house woman wants a standing weekly order," she said. "I told her I'd confirm when I'd verified our consistent production capacity. By week 4, I'll know if we can commit. I'd recommend we do a standing order, stabilizes the income, gives us predictable cash flow, means we're not dependent on spot market prices." Nathaniel set the ledger down carefully. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about nothing else for 2 weeks." Howe was quiet for a moment. Something in his face had that quality again, the one she'd seen in the dairy doorway on the first Saturday, the one she still hadn't fully named. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask that it has nothing to do with the terms of the contract." She looked at him steadily. "Ask. When my brother died," he said, "Emily had no one. Her mother was already gone. Margaret Hale offered to take her. She has a house in Staunton, no children of her own, and she—" He paused, and the pause had the weight of something he'd carried a long time. "She made it clear that her offer came with conditions. That she would take Emily and raise her, but that Emily's parentage would be handled in a way that protected the Hale family's name, which would have meant Emily growing up not knowing who her father was. Not knowing this estate existed. Not knowing you," Sarah said quietly. "Not knowing any of it," he said. "I didn't let that happen, but Margaret has not stopped believing that she has more claim on Emily than I do. And she is not wrong that she knows things about Emily's birth that could cause damage if she chose to use them." He looked at Sarah directly. "She's coming at the end of the month. I want you to know what you're walking into, whatever that is." Sarah was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "It's outside the contract." "Because you're in this house," he said. "And because Emily has talked to you more in 2 weeks than she's talked to anyone in 2 years. And because—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "Because I reckon you ought to know what kind of situation you've walked into. All the way into. Not just the dairy." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the yard, one of the cows made a low sound and went quiet again. Sarah looked at the ledger, at the sales figures, at her own handwriting, neat and sure, the way her father had taught her, every number, clear, every entry, complete, no ambiguity about what was owed and what had been earned. "When does she arrive?" Sarah said. "End of the month," he said. 3 weeks. "All right," she said. She turned the ledger back to face her and picked up her pen. "Then we have 3 weeks. He looked at her. She looked up. "This is my house too, Mr. Carter. For 5 months it's my house too. And that child—" She stopped herself, started again. "Emily is not a problem to be solved, and she is not a bargaining chip. If Mrs. Hale plans to come here and use what she knows as a lever, she's going to find that the situation here is not what she expects." His expression was something she couldn't read. Something between surprise and something else, something quieter. "You haven't met Margaret Hale yet," he said. "No," Sarah said. But I've met enough people who smile while they hold knives to know the look. She held his gaze. How long has she been doing this? Since the week Emily came to live here. Here. 2 years. 2 years. Sarah set her pen down. Mr. Carter, she said. Why haven't you ended it? Whatever leverage she has your brother's behavior before he died. Emily's parentage, whatever it is. Why haven't you just told the truth yourself? Taken that card out of her hand. The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because I was afraid, he said finally, quietly, like a man who doesn't say that kind of thing very often. Of what it would do to Emily. To hear it in public before she'd had time to be steady enough to bear it, Sarah said. Yes. Sarah picked up her pen again. Is she steady enough now? He looked toward the door, as if he could see through it to the house beyond, to the small, dark-haired girl who noticed everything and had learned to hold herself very carefully. She's steadier than she was, he said. Considerably steadier. Sarah wrote a figure in the ledger, let it dry, looked at it. Then maybe, she said, it's time to think about taking that card back. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the east room with the window open and the summer sounds of Western Virginia coming in, night insects, the distant low of the herd, the creak of the house settling, and thought about Emily on the stairs listening. About Margaret Hale smiling and carrying information like a weapon she'd never quite used but never quite put down either. About Nathaniel saying he'd been afraid, saying it plainly, saying it like a man who had decided to tell the truth because he was tired of managing the alternative. She thought about her father, who had trusted the wrong people with the wrong papers, and what that trust had cost him. She thought about what it meant to walk into a situation clear-eyed versus what it meant to discover things too late. She was not going to discover things too late. She got up before 4, went to the dairy, and worked until the light came up over the Blue Ridge. And when Emily appeared in the dairy doorway at 6:30, with her hair not yet brushed and her boots not yet properly laced, Sarah handed her a cup of warm milk without a word, and Emily sat down on the stool in the corner and drank it, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Emily said, "She's going to try to make things complicated." Sarah looked at her. "Mrs. Hale." "She always does," Emily said. "She's good at it. She makes it seem like she's helping, and then you find out later that helping costs something." She turned the cup in her hands. "My mother used to say that Margaret Hale would give you her last piece of bread and find a way to make you feel you owed her a farm." Sarah looked at the girl, at the 9-year-old, who carried her mother's voice inside her like a set of instructions for a world she was still learning to navigate. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," Sarah said. "She was sick a long time," Emily said. "I think being sick a long time makes you see things clearly." She paused. "Or maybe she was always like that, and I just didn't know enough to recognize it yet." Sarah thought about that. "Emily," she said, "whatever Mrs. Hale knows about you, about your parents, your history, none of it changes what you are." Emily looked at her steadily. "I know what I am," she said, and said it with a steadiness that was not bravado. It was something older and harder and more honestly earned. "I'm Emily Carter. Uncle Nathaniel is my family. This is my home." A pause. "I just need the rest of the world to stop arguing about it." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "Then," she said carefully, "we'll need to give them something that isn't arguable." Emily tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Sarah turned back to the dairy ledger. To the sales figures. To the standing order from the boarding house in Millbrook. To the growing column of numbers that meant something real and solid and impossible to take away. "I mean," she said, "that truth is always the best thing to stand on. And the louder the truth, the harder it is to argue with." She looked at Emily. "Your uncle knows that. He just needs to believe that the ground is solid enough to stand on when he says it out loud." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Is it?" she asked. "Solid enough?" Sarah thought about the sound churns the full pails, the wheel aging on the shelf, the name Whitmore mattering again in a market 3 counties wide. Things that had been built. Things that were real. "It's getting there," she said. Emily looked at her for a long, serious moment. Then she climbed down from the stool, set the cup on the work table, and went to get the morning milking pail off the hook on the wall. "Then we'd better keep working," she said. And they did. Margaret Hale arrived on a Wednesday, which was nobody's best day. She came in a hired coach, which told Sarah something. A woman who owned her transportation came and went on her own terms. A woman who hired it arrived on a schedule set by someone else and departed the same way, which meant her time here had edges, limits of departure built into the arrival. Sarah filed that away before the woman had cleared the coach step. She was perhaps 35, fine-boned and carefully dressed in a gray traveling suit that had been well made some years ago, and maintained with the particular discipline of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of argument. Her hair was dark like Emily's. Her eyes were lighter hazel, quick-moving, the kind of eyes that catalogued a room before they settled on any one thing in it. They settled on Sarah. "You must be the dairy woman," Margaret Hale said pleasantly. "Sarah Whitmore," Sarah said. "Welcome to Carter Manor, Mrs. Hale." Something moved behind the hazel eyes, quick assessing there and gone. "Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore's girl, from Harrow's Creek." "That's right." "I was sorry to hear about your father," said with the smooth timing of someone who has practiced condolences until they sound natural. "A terrible loss." "Thank you," Sarah said, and moved aside to let her pass, and watched the way Margaret Hale walked through the front door of Carter Manor, like a woman walking into a place she had already decided belonged to her, or should, or would. Nathaniel met them in the front hall. He was composed the way he was always composed, but Sarah, who had spent 3 weeks learning the grammar of his face, saw the tightening around his eyes when Margaret Hale smiled at him. "Nathaniel," Margaret said warmly, "you look tired." "Margaret," he said. "How was the road?" "Long." She looked around the hall. "The house looks well. Better than my last visit, I think." Her eyes moved to the staircase. "Is Emily here?" Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, composed and careful, and wearing the expression Sarah had come to recognize as her armor. Not cold, but contained everything held just slightly back from the surface. She came down the stairs at a measured pace. "Hello, Aunt Margaret." Margaret Hale opened her arms. Emily walked into them and accepted the embrace with the specific stillness of a child who has learned to receive affection without necessarily trusting it. "You've grown," Margaret said, holding her at arm's length. "You look like your mother." Emily said nothing. "We've put you in the blue room," Nathaniel said. "Mrs. Brooks will show you up." "Of course." Margaret released Emily, glanced at Sarah once more, the same quick cataloging look, pleasant on the surface and busy underneath, and followed Mrs. Brooks toward the stairs. At the third step, she stopped and turned back. "I'll need a few days," she said to Nathaniel. "There are some things I'd like to discuss, about Emily's situation, about the future." A beat perfectly timed. It's past time we settled some things properly. She went up the stairs. The hall was very quiet. Emily stood where Margaret had left her, looking at the empty staircase. "She's been planning this visit," Emily said. Not a question. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "How long?" He was quiet. "Uncle Nathaniel," Emily said, and turned to look at him, and her voice was quiet and direct, and entirely too old for her face. "How long has she been planning this?" He looked at his niece for a long moment. "I reckon since the week you came here," he said. Emily absorbed that. Her face didn't change, but something behind it did, a settling, like a person deciding to stop waiting for bad news and simply face it. "All right," she said, and went back upstairs. Sarah and Nathaniel stood alone in the front hall. 3 days, she said quietly. "You said the coach is hired. She can't stay beyond what she's paid for." "Money hasn't stopped her before," he said. "It will this time," Sarah said. "Because this time, you're not going to give her anything to negotiate with." He looked at her. "Whatever she knows," Sarah said, "whatever she's been holding, you take it from her before she can use it. You say it yourself on your own terms, before she gets the chance to say it on hers." She held his gaze. "That's the only way to end this, Mr. Carter." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the hired coach was pulling away down the road. You make it sound simple, he said. It isn't simple, she said. But it's the only thing that works. Dinner that evening was a precise and careful performance, the kind that happens when everyone at the table knows something is coming and no one is willing to start it. Margaret Hale was gracious. She asked Nathaniel about the estate's timber operation, about the fall harvest. Outlook about the roof on the north barn that had apparently needed attention since her last visit. She asked Emily about her reading, her sewing, whether she had friends her age in the nearby settlement. She ate everything on her plate and complimented Mrs. Brooks on the bread. She addressed Sarah twice, once to ask how long she'd been at Carter Manor, and once to ask with a smile that had warmth on top and something else entirely underneath, whether it was usual for a dairy manager to take meals at the family table. Miss Whitmore manages the household operations as well, Nathaniel said before Sarah could answer. She dines with us. Margaret looked at him. Of course, she said pleasantly. How practical. The word practical did a great deal of work in that sentence. Sarah ate her dinner and said nothing and watched Margaret Hale, the way she watched things she needed to understand fully without telegraphing the attention. Emily ate steadily and spoke only when spoken to, and once, when Margaret said something about Staunton being a finer place than she remembered, for raising children, looked at Sarah with an expression so brief and precise it might have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. Sarah looked back. A small confirming nod. Emily picked up her fork. After dinner, when Emily had been sent upstairs and Mrs. Brooks had retreated to the kitchen, Margaret accepted a glass of cider in the sitting room and arranged herself in the chair nearest the window with the ease of a woman who had decided which chair was hers before she sat in it. I'll be direct, Margaret said. Please, said Nathaniel. He stood near the fireplace. Sarah had stayed in the room because he'd looked at her briefly before sitting. The kind of look that was also a question, and she'd answered it by sitting down. Margaret looked at Sarah. This is a private family matter. Miss Whitmore stays, Nathaniel said. A beat. Margaret smoothed her skirt. Very well. She looked at Nathaniel. I've been patient, Nathaniel. You know I have. Emily has been here 2 years. She's settled. She seems content. I've raised no challenge to your arrangement. But the situation regarding her parentage. Emily knows who she is, Nathaniel said. Emily knows what you've told her, Margaret said, gently, implacably. What the county knows is something different. What the church registry says is something different. If something were to happen to you, if this estate were to face difficulty, legal or financial, Emily would have no protected standing. She could not inherit. She could be contested. She could be... What is it you're proposing, Margaret? His voice was even. Too even. Margaret set down her cider glass. I'm proposing that Emily come to Staunton, with me, where I can provide her a proper social standing, a proper education, introductions to proper society when the time comes, where the question about her parentage, a pause perfectly weighted, would simply never arise because no one there to ask them. The silence was absolute. Sarah felt the structure of it, the elegance of the trap. Come to Staunton, start over, leave the question behind by burying it, and bury Emily's knowledge of herself along with it. No, Nathaniel said. Margaret's expression didn't change. I thought you might say that, so I want you to understand what I'm offering as an alternative. She folded her hands in her lap. I am willing to stay quiet about what I know, about James, about the circumstances of Emily's birth, about the woman Emily's mother was before. She stopped herself. I have stayed quiet for 2 years. I would like to continue doing so. But I need to know that Emily's future is being properly arranged, that she will have proper standing, that you intend to. The pause was calibrated. Provide this household with the female leadership that a growing girl requires. Nathaniel was very still. You're asking me to marry, he said. I'm asking you to make a decision, Margaret said pleasantly, about Emily's future, one way or another. The fire popped. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked, the sound of small feet moving quietly, the sound of a child who had crept to the top of the stairs and was listening. Sarah heard it. She looked at Nathaniel. He heard it too. She saw the moment he heard it, saw something move through his face that was not anger and not grief, but was something between them, something that made a decision. He looked at Margaret Hale. "I need to show you something," he said. He stood and walked to the writing desk in the corner and opened the lower drawer and took out a folded document that looked like it had been handled carefully, kept deliberately for a long time. He set it on the table between them. Margaret looked at it. Her expression shifted the first real shift, the first moment the pleasant surface cracked along an edge. "That's James's letter," she said, quietly. "It's James's letter," he agreed. "Written the month before he died, acknowledging Emily as his daughter, asking me to take her in and protect her future. Witnessed by Reverend Alderman from the church at Millbrook." He looked at Margaret steadily. "It was filed with the county clerk's office 4 months after Emily came to live here. It's been a matter of public record for 20 months. Margaret stared at the document. "You never told me," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't. Then all this time. All the time you've been holding what you know," he said quietly. "It's been on record. Emily's parentage, her standing, her right to this estate." He paused. "What you know, Margaret, is already known. I simply chose not to tell you that I'd made it known." The room was absolutely still. Margaret Hale looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked up at Nathaniel with an expression that had been stripped of all its careful pleasantness, and was something rawer and more honest underneath, not evil. Sarah thought. Not calculating. Just frightened. A frightened woman who had been holding a weapon for 2 years and had just discovered it was never loaded. "Then why?" Margaret said, and her voice had lost its smoothness. "Did you let me go on believing?" "Because I wasn't ready," he said, and said it the way he'd said to Sarah, that he'd been afraid, plainly, without apology. Like a man who has decided the truth costs less than the management of its absence. "Because Emily wasn't ready. Because I needed time to make sure the ground was solid before I invited anyone to stand on it." He looked toward the door, toward the staircase beyond it. "Is it solid now?" Sarah asked, quietly. Just for him. He looked at her, held her gaze for a moment that had more in it than either of them acknowledged. "Getting there," he said. "Emily came downstairs on her own. Nobody called her. Nobody went to get her. She simply appeared in the sitting room doorway in her nightgown, with her dark hair loose, and her gray eyes moving from her uncle to Margaret Hale, to Sarah, and back to Margaret, with the assessing intelligence of a crow, working out the geometry of a situation. "I heard," she said, not defiant, just stating a fact. Margaret looked at her. Something crossed the woman's face. Complicated, real, the grief of someone who has been doing the wrong thing for the right reasons for so long that the distinction has blurred. "Emily," she started. "You knew my father," Emily said. Not an accusation. A question, a real one, from a child who has wanted the answer for a long time. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I knew James." "Was he good?" Emily asked. "Before he wasn't." The question landed like a stone in still water. Margaret looked at the girl for a long moment. And something in her face did what faces do sometimes when a child asks a question so direct and so true that all the careful adult architecture around the answer becomes impossible to maintain. "How was charming," Margaret said. "He was funny. He was—" She stopped. "He wasn't good to your mother, toward the end. But before that—" Another stop. "He loved her, I think, in the way people love things they don't know how to keep." Emily absorbed this. "Did he know about me?" she asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "He knew." "Did he want to know me?" The longest pause yet. Margaret looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her, and something passed between them. Not alliance, but recognition. The recognition of two people who have been orbiting the same grief from different distances. "I believe he intended to," Margaret said finally. "He ran out of time." Emily considered this with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Then she said, "All right," in the voice of someone setting something down that she's been carrying at some distance from her body, held carefully so it wouldn't spill. She looked at Margaret directly. "I don't want to go to Staunton." "Emily, this is my home," Emily said. Uncle Nathaniel is my family. That's not going to change. She paused. You can visit. You're my mother's sister, and I reckon that means something. But this is my home. Margaret looked at the girl. At the 9-year-old who had just spoken with more clarity and more authority than any adult in the room had managed for 2 years. She pressed her lips together. And for a moment, briefly, her eyes were bright. All right, Margaret Hale said quietly. Sarah found Nathaniel on the back porch an hour later, after Margaret had gone to bed, and Emily had been tucked in, and the house had settled into its night sounds. He was standing with his arms resting on the porch rail, looking out at the dark yard at the dairy building where a single lantern still burned low. She had left that lantern burning deliberately. She always did last thing. It helped her know from the house that everything was as she'd left it. You did the right thing, she said. He didn't answer immediately. 2 years ago, he said, I thought keeping it quiet was protecting her. I thought if I just managed it carefully enough, she'd be old enough to understand by the time it became an issue. He looked at the lantern in the dairy window. I should have filed that document and told everyone who asked. You filed it, Sarah said. That was the right thing. I didn't tell anyone. You told the county clerk, she said. That counts more than you think. He was quiet. Emily was remarkable tonight, Sarah said. She's always been remarkable, he said. I've been underestimating how much she could bear. A pause. You told her, didn't you? Some version of it. You prepared her. Sarah considered denying it, decided against it. I told her that truth was the best thing to stand on, she said. She came to the rest herself. He turned and looked at her. In the darkness, he was less composed than usual, not undone, but unclenched the way people go, when the thing they've been braced against has finally arrived and turned out to be survivable. Why are you doing this? He said. It's outside the contract. She looked at him steadily. You asked me that before. I'm asking again. She was quiet for a moment. The night insects sang in the dark beyond the porch. The dairy lantern burned. Because Emily matters, she said. And because, she stopped, started again more carefully. Because I've spent 6 weeks watching you carry something you didn't have to carry alone, and it seemed wasteful. He looked at her for a long time. Miss Whitmore, he said. And then he said nothing else, just her name, but in the saying of it, something changed the tone, the weight of it, the way it sat in the air between them. She looked back at him. This was the moment she thought where one of them would say something that moved things forward. Or one of them would step back. And she knew which one it would be, because she knew herself. I'm going to check the lantern, she said. Good night, Mr. Carter. She went down the porch steps and across the yard and into the dairy, and stood in the quiet for a moment, with her hand on the warm glass of the lantern. Her heart was doing something she didn't entirely approve of. She turned down the lantern, stood in the dark. Then she heard the porch step creak behind her, not close, not crossing the yard, just the sound of him still standing on the porch instead of going inside, which was its own kind of answer to something she hadn't asked. She stood in the dark dairy until the porch step creaked again, retreating, and the back door opened and closed. Then she let herself breathe. The next morning, Margaret Hale came to the dairy. Sarah was alone midway through the morning pressing when she heard the knock, hesitant, nothing like Nathaniel's 2 clean raps. She looked up, and Margaret was in the doorway in her traveling clothes, her hair done, but her face less arranged than it had been the evening before. May I come in? Margaret said. Of course, Sarah said. Margaret stepped inside. She looked around the dairy at the clean equipment, the organized shelves, the aging wheels, the full ledger on the table with an expression that was harder to read than any she'd worn at dinner. You've done a great deal in a short time, she said. The work was here, Sarah said. It just needed doing. How long is your contract? 5 months. And after? Sarah pressed the wheel. Steady pressure, even. That depends on a few things, she said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She moved to the aging shelf and looked at the wheels the way Mrs. Brooks had looked at the first one, with genuine attention, without performance. I want you to understand something, Margaret said. What I was doing, what I've been doing. I don't expect you to. You don't need to explain yourself to me, Mrs. Hale, Sarah said. I know I don't. A pause. I want to. She turned from the shelf. My sister died in a difficult situation with no legal protection for herself or her daughter. I watched that happen. I watched James Carter charm her and leave her and charm her again, and she let him every time because she loved him, and loving him was the thing she was best at. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. When she died, I thought taking Emily would be... She stopped. I thought it was the right thing. I told myself it was for Emily, but I wanted... She pressed her lips together. I wanted someone. I didn't have anyone, and Emily looked like my sister, and I... She stopped. You were lonely, Sarah said, without judgment. Margaret looked at her. Yes, she said. And the word came out stripped of everything except its own truth. Sarah picked up the press handle, set it down again, turned to face Margaret fully. She's not going to Staunton, she said, but she doesn't have to lose you either. Those two things aren't the same. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. You're very direct, Miss Whitmore. I've been told that, Sarah said. I find it saves time. Something that might under different circumstances have been a smile moved across Margaret Hale's face. Yes, she said. I imagine it does. She looked at the aging shelf one more time. That first wheel, the one on the left, is it for market? Yes, Saturday. I'll buy it from you, Margaret said. Full price. I'd like to take it back to Staunton. She paused. I'd like to be able to say when I serve it that I knew who made it. Sarah looked at her for a moment. I'll have it wrapped by Friday. Friday, she said. Margaret nodded and left. Sarah stood in the quiet dairy and thought about what it meant when an enemy decided to become something else. Not an ally necessarily, but something less dangerous. Something with a shape that could be worked with instead of defended against. She thought it probably meant that the real work was only just beginning. She found out how right she was on Friday morning. She was in the kitchen with Mrs. Brooks going over the weekly supply order when Doss came in from the yard with a letter in his hand and the specific expression of a person delivering something they didn't ask to be responsible for. Come for Mr. Carter, he said. But he's out in the south field, and the man who brought it said it was urgent. Said to give it to whoever's in charge of the house. He held it out. Sarah took it. Mrs. Brooks looked at the seal. County Assessor, Mrs. Brooks said, flatly. The way you say a name you recognize and don't welcome. Sarah looked at it. I'll take it to him, she said. She found Nathaniel at the fence line of the south field, talking to Cal about the fall grazing rotation, and she held out the letter without preamble and watched his face as he read it. She had learned in 3 weeks to read what his face was not doing as much as what it was. Right now, it was not doing quite a lot. What is it? She said. He folded the letter, looked at the field. There's a lien, he said. On the north quarter of the property, my brother's debt. I knew about it. I'd been managing the payments. He paused. Apparently the terms have been changed. The note's been sold. New holder is calling the debt in full, by the 1st of October. The 1st of October was 11 weeks away. Sarah did the arithmetic the way she did all arithmetic, quickly, precisely, without sentiment. How much? She said. He told her. She breathed in, breathed out. Can you cover it? She said. Not without selling something, he said. The north quarter itself, or... He stopped. Or finding another way. Cal was looking steadily at the fence post in front of him, with the dignity of a man pretending he wasn't hearing any of this. Sarah looked at the dairy building visible across the property, her lantern hook on the east wall, her aging shelf, her ledger full of 2 weeks of numbers that were already changing what Carter Manor could do and could pay. How much does the dairy need to produce by October 1st, she said, to make a meaningful difference? He looked at her. Sarah. It was the first time he had used her name. They both noticed it. Neither of them addressed it. How much, she said. He told her. She did the arithmetic again. It's not enough on its own, she said. Not in 11 weeks, but combined with what else you can pull. She was thinking out loud now, running numbers, running the way her father had taught her to run them. The standing order from Millbrook the fall market season, if we expand the butter production and I take the second wheel to the Staunton market. You can't fix this with cheese, Miss Whitmore. I'm not fixing it with cheese, she said. I'm giving you more ground to stand on when you go to renegotiate the terms. She held his gaze. The note was sold. That means the original lender needed liquidity. The new holder bought it because they want return on investment, not a land dispute. They want their money. If you go to them with a functioning estate showing increasing revenue... She stopped. I was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to the look of a man who has been carrying weight for so long that someone else's offer to share it doesn't compute immediately. You've thought about this, he said. Same thing he'd said about the dairy contract 3 weeks ago. I think about everything, she said. It's a habit. He looked at the letter in his hand. At the field. At the dairy. The harvest gathering is in 4 weeks, he said slowly. Every neighbor, every creditor, every county official, everyone attends. He paused. If I were to make a public statement there about Emily, about James, about the estate's standing, you'd be saying it before the October deadline, Sarah said. On your own terms, from a position of a functioning estate with a clean public record. She met his eyes. That's the ground I was talking about. That's what I meant when I said we had 3 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. Cal was still studying the fence post. 4 weeks, Nathaniel said. 4 weeks, she said. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, looked at the field one more time. I need to know something, he said. And his voice had changed quieter, more careful the way it went when he was about to say something he'd been choosing the words for. Ask, she said. When your contract ends, he said. At the 5 months, where do you intend to go? She looked at him steadily. I intend to go wherever I've earned enough to go, she said. On my own terms, the way I told you at the beginning. And if... He stopped. What if the terms changed? The field was quiet around them. Somewhere in the middle distance, one of the cows lowed and went silent. Mr. Carter, she said. Ask me in 4 weeks. He held her gaze. 4 weeks, he said. She turned and walked back toward the dairy, and she did not let herself look back because looking back was a luxury, and she had 4 weeks of work to do, and a debt to help manage, and a harvest gathering to prepare for, and a 9-year-old girl whose home needed to be made permanent. And all of that was more important than whatever her face might do if she looked back at him, standing in his south field, holding a letter and watching her go. More important. She almost believed it. The 4 weeks before the harvest gathering were the hardest and the most clarifying of Sarah's life. She understood by the end of the first of those 4 weeks that she had made a strategic error. Not in the dairy. The dairy was performing beyond even her revised projections. The standing order from Millbrook confirmed a second buyer from Staunton, making inquiries after Margaret Hale had apparently served that first wheel at a dinner party and refused to say where she'd gotten it until 3 people asked. Not in the household, Mrs. Brooks had arrived at something that wasn't quite warmth, but was a functional and honest working partnership, which Sarah valued more than warmth anyway. Not with Emily, who came to the dairy every afternoon, and had begun quietly and without announcement to keep her own small ledger of the herd's daily production, her handwriting careful and her numbers exact. The error was simpler and harder to fix than any of those things. She had let herself start caring about the outcome. Not the dairy's outcome, not the estate's outcome. The outcome of Nathaniel Carter, standing at a harvest gathering in 4 weeks and saying the true thing out loud, and whether it would be enough, and whether the debt could be managed, and whether Emily's home would still be Emily's home when October came. She had started caring the way you start caring about things when you've stopped being a visitor and become without quite deciding to a part of something. That was the error. Because caring about outcomes meant the outcomes could hurt you. And she had spent the last 3 months carefully building a life in which things could not hurt her anymore. And she had apparently built it with a door she hadn't noticed, and Nathaniel Carter had walked through it on the first day, and Emily had walked through it shortly after, and neither of them had asked permission. They had simply been themselves consistently and without performance. And here she was. She worked harder. That was what she did when thinking became counterproductive. She worked until the thinking had somewhere to go. The butter production expanded. She negotiated a contract with the boarding house in Millbrook for weekly delivery through the winter, a first for the estate money that could be counted on rather than hoped for. She took the second-aged wheel to the Staunton market herself, arriving before dawn, selling before the other dairy operations had their tables set up, returning with a purse that made Cal whistle low through his teeth on the drive home. "Reckon you could sell water to a river," Cal said. "I sold cheese to people who wanted cheese," she said. "That's just math." "It ain't just math," he said. "Your daddy knew that too." She looked at the road. "Don't," she said, quietly. Cal understood. He didn't say anything more about her father, but he did when they arrived back at Carter Manor, carry the empty crates inside without being asked which was his version of the same thing. She was tallying the week's revenue on Thursday evening when Nathaniel came to the dairy with a face she didn't recognize. She had cataloged his expressions by now. Composed, almost composed, the specific tightness around the eyes that meant something difficult, the brief loosening that passed for relief. This was none of those. "The note holder," he said. "He wants to meet." She set down her pen. "When?" "Tomorrow. He's coming here." "Here." She looked up. "He's coming to the estate." "I wants to see it," Nathaniel said, "before he decides on terms." Sarah thought about that, turned it over. "What's his name?" she said. "Aldrich. Benjamin Aldrich. He's a merchant out of Richmond. Bought the note 3 weeks ago from the original lender." He paused. "He's not a banker. He's a businessman. He buys distressed debts and either collects or acquires the property." "He wants the North Quarter," she said. "Probably." "Then we need to make him want the money more than he wants the land," she said. She picked up her pen. "What time does he arrive?" "Mid-morning." "All right." She was already writing. "I need you to do something tonight." "What?" She looked up. "Get the full estate ledger. 3 years. Everything. Bring it to me." He looked at her for a moment. "Sarah." "I need to see what we're working with," she said. "All of it. Not just the dairy numbers. Everything." I went and got the ledgers. He came back and sat down across the table from her, and they went through 3 years of Carter estate accounts together by lamplight. And it was the most honest 2 hours she had spent with another person since her father died, because there was nothing in those numbers that could be softened or managed. They were simply what they were, and they both knew it, and they worked with what was real. At 10:30 she sat back and looked at what she'd written. "It's workable," she said. "Is it? The dairy revenue alone won't cover it. But the dairy revenue combined with the timber sale you were already planning for spring, plus the winter standing order from Millbrook plus..." She traced a column with her finger. "This grain yield. If you sell at market, rather than holding for spring, you take a smaller price, but you take it now. Put it against the principal. Show Aldrich a payment timeline with real numbers behind it, not promises." She looked up. "He bought a distressed debt. He expects either default or negotiation. You give him a third option, a functioning estate with documented revenue showing a clear payment trajectory. Businessmen want return. You give him a better return than foreclosure, and he takes it." Nathaniel looked at the figures she'd written, looked at them for a long time. "You're good at this," he said. "My father was better," she said. "But he trusted his goodness to protect him from bad contracts. I learned from that." He looked at her, at the thing she'd said and the thing underneath it. "I'm sorry," he said, "about what happened to your father's estate." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Help me make sure it doesn't happen to yours." Benjamin Aldrich arrived the next morning in his own coach with his own driver, a compact man of about 50, with the careful eyes of someone who made his living. Reading situations faster than the situations could read him. He shook Nathaniel's hand. He looked at the house. He looked at the outbuildings. His eyes stopped on the dairy. "That's the building that was shuttered," he said. "It's operational now," Nathaniel said. "Has been for 6 weeks." Aldrich looked at him. The report I received said the estate was undermanned and the dairy abandoned. The report was 6 weeks old, Sarah said. She had positioned herself on the porch steps when she heard the coach come in because she had decided the night before that if she was going to be useful, she needed to be visible. Sarah Whitmore, I manage the dairy and household operations. Aldrich looked at her with the appraising, non-personal attention of a man used to assessing assets. Whitmore, Thomas Whitmore's daughter. Yes, sir. I bought grain from your father's operation twice, he said. Best graded yield I saw that season. He looked at the dairy again. You opened the dairy? Yes, sir. In 6 weeks. 5 properly speaking. The 6th week was full operation. He looked at Nathaniel. I'd like to see the numbers. They sat in the front room, all 3 of them, and Sarah laid out what she'd written the night before, clear, every figure sourced and documented the dairy revenue, the standing order contract, the projected winter income, the spring timber sale, the grain recommendation, the payment timeline that put the debt fully cleared by the following autumn. Aldrich read it twice. He asked 3 questions, all of them sharp, all of them exactly the right questions, and she answered them exactly. No padding, no optimism beyond what the numbers supported. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Nathaniel. This is your manager's projection, he said. Yes, Nathaniel said. It's conservative, Aldrich said. I'd rather present conservative figures and exceed them. Sarah said, than present ambitious ones and fall short. Aldrich looked at her. Something in his expression shifted the professional assessment, acquiring a human edge. Your father thought the same way, he said. I remember him saying something like that the second time I bought from him. A pause. I was sorry to hear he lost the farm. The room was quiet. So was I, Sarah said. Aldrich looked at the papers one more time. Then he picked up his pen and wrote a number at the bottom of her payment timeline. A revised first installment, smaller than the original demand, with a note against it that Sarah recognized as a 12-month extension on the full payment. He slid it across the table. She looked at it, looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel picked it up, read it, set it down. That's acceptable, he said. I thought it might be, Aldrich said. He stood and buttoned his coat, looked at the dairy building through the window. That's a fine operation, Miss Whitmore. Your father would recognize it. He shook Nathaniel's hand, nodded to Sarah, and left. The front room was very quiet. Sarah looked at the revised figure on the paper, at the 12-month extension, at the space that had just opened between where they were and where October had been threatening to take them. She heard Nathaniel exhale beside her. Not dramatically, just a slow, full release of breath, the kind that has been held for longer than a morning. You did that, he said. You did it, she said. Your estate, your name, your payment. I just organized the numbers. Don't do that, he said. She looked at him. Don't reduce what you did to arithmetic, he said. It wasn't arithmetic. She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said. I suppose it wasn't. Emily found out about the debt that evening. Not because anyone told her. Because she had been keeping her own ledger for 3 weeks, and she was Thomas Whitmore's student. 3 removes back, and she was 9 years old and already understood that numbers told stories if you read them correctly, and she had been reading them correctly. She came to the dairy after supper with her small ledger in her hands and set it on the work table and looked at Sarah with the direct gray eyes that saw everything. We're in trouble, she said. With money. Sarah considered her options. Chose honesty the way she always chose it, because the alternative cost more in the end. We were, she said. It's been addressed. By you, Emily said. By Mr. Aldrich, who decided a payment timeline was better business than a foreclosure, Sarah said. I helped organize the argument. Emily looked at her ledger, at the numbers she'd compiled from 3 weeks of observation. I've been watching the grain yield, she said. I think if you sell the East Quarter's yield separately from the main harvest, you get a better per bushel rate because the quality's higher. Cal said so to Doss last week, and I don't think he knew I was listening. Sarah stared at her. That's... She stopped. Emily, that's a sound observation. I know, Emily said, without arrogance, simply as fact. I've been making sound observations for 3 weeks. I just didn't know if anyone wanted to hear them. Sarah looked at the girl's ledger. At the neat columns, the careful handwriting, the instinct for what mattered, encoded in a 9-year-old's careful numbers. From now on, Sarah said, I want to hear them. All of them. Emily looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down across the table and opened her ledger and began explaining the East Quarter grain observation in detail. And Sarah listened with the complete attention of someone encountering for the second time in her life a mind that worked the way her own did. The first time had been her father. 4 days before the harvest gathering, Margaret Hale sent a letter. Sarah was in the kitchen when Mrs. Brooks read it and handed it to Nathaniel without comment, which meant Mrs. Brooks had already formed an opinion and was keeping it to herself, which was itself a form of opinion. Nathaniel read it, folded it, set it on the table. She's not coming, he said. Mrs. Brooks said nothing. She's written to the church registry in Millbrook, he said. She's submitted a formal attestation supporting Emily's parentage claim. Witnesses dates her account of what James told her before he died. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't have to do that. No, Sarah said. She didn't. He looked at the letter, at the folded paper that represented Margaret Hale, deciding finally what kind of person she intended to be. She says she'll visit at Christmas, if Emily wants her to. Emily will want her to, Sarah said. You're sure, Dee, Emily wants everyone to be who they're capable of being, Sarah said. She's been waiting for her aunt to figure out who that is. He looked at her across the kitchen, at what she'd just said about Emily, and in the way that things sometimes carry more than their surface about other people's capacity to become what they were capable of being. He picked up the letter and went to his study. Sarah went back to the dairy, but she thought for the rest of that afternoon about what it meant when people decided to do the right thing, not because they were forced to, but because they'd finally worked out that it was the only thing left worth doing. She thought her father would have called it grace. She wasn't sure she believed in grace, but she believed in the decision. That was enough. The harvest gathering came on a Saturday in late September, with a sky so blue it looked intentional and air that had finally broken from summer into the particular early autumn clarity that made the Blue Ridge look close enough to touch. Half the county came. That was how it worked. The Carters had hosted the gathering for 2 generations, and people came from 3 settlements, over farmers and merchants and churchgoers, and the merely curious with covered dishes and children, and the specific social energy of a community that has been working hard all season and is ready briefly to stop. Sarah had been preparing for 4 days. Not the food. Mrs. Brooks handled the food with the efficiency of a general commanding a campaign. Sarah had been preparing for what Nathaniel was going to say, and when and how the ground needed to be ready for him to say it on. The gathering was established for 2 hours conversation and eating and the easy commerce of community before Nathaniel called for attention. He stood in the center of the yard, with the kind of stillness that gets a crowd quiet without having to shout for it. The stillness of a man who has decided what he's going to do and has stopped spending energy on anything else. The crowd settled. Sarah stood at the edge of it, near the dairy building near Cal and Doss and Wick, who had arranged themselves without being told in a loose half-circle that said in the body language of working men, "This is our place and our employer, and we are here." Emily stood beside Mrs. Brooks near the porch, hands clasped back straight with the focused composure of a 9-year-old who has been told what is coming and has chosen to meet it standing up. "Most of you know me," Nathaniel said. His voice carried without effort. "Most of you knew my brother James, and most of you have had questions for the past 2 years that I haven't answered directly. That's on me. I've been waiting until I was sure the ground was solid." He paused. "It's solid." The crowd was very still. "Emily Carter is my brother's daughter," he said. "Her mother was Charlotte Hale, who died 4 years ago. James acknowledged her before he died. The documentation is filed with the county clerk's office, has been for 20 months. Emily Carter is a legal heir of this estate, and she is my family, and this is her home. That is not going to change." Nobody spoke. Sarah watched the faces, the people working through it, the ones who'd suspected, and the ones who hadn't, and the ones who'd heard rumors, and the ones who'd been waiting for exactly this. The working through was visible, real, the way it is when a community processes true information rather than managing false ones. A man near the front, she recognized him as the deacon from the Millbrook Church, looked at Nathaniel for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. Deliberate. "Glad to know it proper," the deacon said, and turned back to his plate. That was all it took. The crowd moved. People went back to talking, eating. The children resumed their chasing of each other across the grass. A few people, the ones who needed to say something directly, made their way to Nathaniel. Not with controversy, but with the plain acknowledgement of neighbors who respected a man for telling the truth, even late. Emily had not moved from the porch. Sarah crossed the yard to her. "All right," she said. Emily looked at the crowd, at her uncle accepting a handshake from the deacon, at the ordinary, continuing, unremarkable activity of the gathering that had just absorbed the truth without breaking. "He said it," Emily said, quietly. "He said it?" Sarah agreed. "I thought—" Emily stopped. "I thought it would be bigger. I thought people would—" "Most things that feel enormous from the inside look manageable from the outside," Sarah said. "That's not a bad thing. It means the world is less fragile than we think." Emily looked at her. "Is it less fragile?" Sarah thought about the dairy, about what had been broken and what had been built, about an 11-week deadline that had become a 12-month extension because the numbers had been organized and the argument had been made and the estate was real and functioning and evidently worth investing in rather than dismantling. About a woman in a gray traveling suit who had sent a letter to a church registry instead of coming to make trouble because she'd found her way to a better version of herself. About a 9-year-old's ledger with a grain yield observation that had been entirely correct. "Sometimes," Sarah said, "when people decide to be decent." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Pearson is looking at you." Sarah looked up. Mrs. Pearson was a neighbor's wife, a sharp-eyed woman of about 60, who had been watching Sarah with the focused interest of a person doing arithmetic. "She's trying to figure out who you are," Emily said. "She's been watching you all afternoon." "Let her watch," Sarah said. "She's going to ask Uncle Nathaniel about you," Emily said. "She asks him about everything. She's been asking him about remarrying since the year he turned 28. "Good for her," Sarah said. "She's going to tell him you're too capable to stay," Emily said. "She always tells him that about anyone capable." A pause. "She told him that about me once. She said capable children leave." Sarah looked at the girl. "She was wrong," Emily said simply. "I'm not leaving." "No," Sarah said. "You're not." "Are you?" Emily said. The question sat between them, with the directness of a child who has decided that she has lost enough people to ask the question directly, rather than wait to find out. Sarah looked at the gathering. At the people, the food, the ordinary human texture of a community going about the business of being a community. At Mrs. Brooks on the porch, with her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral, which was her version of something she wouldn't say. At Cal, who had refilled his plate and was talking to Wick with the ease of men who have decided they work somewhere worth working. At Nathaniel, across the yard, who had finished with the deacon and was now standing slightly apart from the crowd and looking, she realized, at her. "I don't know yet," she said. "Honestly." Emily considered this. "That's not a no," she said. "No," Sarah said. "It isn't." Nathaniel found her by the dairy building an hour later, when the gathering had begun its slow migration toward departure, and the yard was thinning out, and the afternoon light was going golden and long, the way it did in late September, like the year gathering itself before letting go. He stood beside her without preamble. "It went well," she said. "Better than I expected." "I told you the ground was solid." "You did," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich's terms are manageable. The grain sale is arranged. The Millbrook contract covers the winter." He paused. "The dairy will exceed the bonus threshold by the end of next week." I know," she said. "That means—" "I know what it means," she said. "I know exactly where we are in the contract." He was quiet. "You've been counting," she said. I've been counting since the first week, he said. She looked at the dairy building. At the lantern hook on the east wall, her addition already familiar enough to be unremarkable. At the door that hung properly, now true in its frame, opening and closing. The way things were supposed to, when someone took the time to fix them right. Mrs. Pearson told me you'll leave, he said, when the contract's done. Mrs. Pearson tells you a great deal, she said. She's not wrong usually. She's not wrong about capable people often leaving, Sarah said. She's wrong about the reason. She turned to look at him directly. I'm not leaving because I'm capable. I'm leaving because the contract ends. Those are different things. He held her gaze. Are they? Yes, she said. One is about ability. The other is about terms. And if the terms changed, he said, for the second time. The same question he'd asked in the South Field 4 weeks ago, when she'd told him to ask her again at the gathering. The gathering was now. She looked at him. I told you, she said, to ask me in 4 weeks. It's been 4 weeks, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The yard sounds, children, horses, departing wagons moved around them without touching the small, still space where they were standing. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go, she said. I need you to understand that first. I know that, he said. I've known that since the second day. I'm not staying because Emily needs someone, she said. Emily is going to be fine regardless. She was already fine. She was always going to be fine. I know that too, he said. I'm not staying because the debt needed managing, or the harvest gathering needed preparation, or any of the practical things that have needed doing, she said. I can walk away from all of those with a clean conscience because they're in better order than I found them. Then why? He said, quietly. She looked at him, at the gray eyes that had been reading things correctly since the first morning. At the man who had told her he'd been afraid and hadn't apologized for it. Who had stood in a yard full of neighbors and said the true thing out loud on his own terms because the ground was solid enough. Because, she said, you asked me to stay the right way. He was very still. You didn't offer me security, she said. You didn't offer me rescue. You didn't ask me to be grateful or compliant or less than what I am. She held his gaze. You offered me work and fair terms and told me the truth about what I was walking into. And then you let me decide. She paused. Nobody has done that before. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had that quality she'd seen on the first Saturday morning in the dairy, fully open, the way it went when something he'd given up on came back alive. Sarah, he said. I'm not finished, she said. He waited. When my 5 months are up, she said, I want a dairy lease, in my name, independent of whatever else happens between us. My own operation, my own account, my own standing. She held his gaze firmly. That's not negotiable. It was never negotiable, he said. I arranged it 3 weeks ago. She stared at him. With the county clerk, he said. A parcel of the east pasture and the dairy building, in your name, as of the contract's end date. He looked at her steadily. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to be a factor in any decision you made. I wanted your decision to be free. The yard was very quiet around them. Sarah looked at the man who had quietly, without announcement, done the exact right thing for the exact right reason. She thought about her father saying that good work was its own argument. She thought about the split boot and the kitchen door, and 3 words that had felt like an insult and turned out to be the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She thought about Emily's ledger and Cal's silence on the drive home from Millbrook and a single lantern burning in the dairy window and what it meant to build something real. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, she said again, and this time it meant something larger than those 2 words had any right to contain, and they both knew it. Across the yard on the porch. Emily Carter stood with her arms crossed and watched them both with the sharp gray eyes that noticed everything. And even from that distance, she could see the exact moment the shape of things changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but the way solid things change, the way ground changes when something real is finally built on it. She uncrossed her arms. She went inside to set an extra place at the supper table. The extra place at the supper table became a permanent arrangement without anyone formally deciding it should be. That was how most of the important things happened at Carter Manor in the weeks that followed the harvest gathering. Not by announcement, not by negotiation, but by accumulation. One evening became two. Two became a week. The week became the shape of things, and the shape of things became, without ceremony, the way things were. Sarah noticed it, the way she noticed everything, precisely without sentimentality, and with the particular awareness of someone who has learned that good things require the same careful tending as good dairy operations. Leave them unattended, and they sour. Manage them too aggressively, and you kill what made them worth having. The right approach was consistent, honest attention, the kind that didn't perform itself. The contract ended on a Tuesday. Neither of them mentioned it. What they both knew without saying was that the dairy lease had been filed with the county clerk 3 weeks prior. Sarah Whitmore was, as of that Tuesday, a property owner in her own right, a small parcel of east pasture, and a dairy building with a repaired door and a lantern hook she'd installed herself on the east wall. The lease was in her name. The operation was hers. She could walk away from Carter Manor that Tuesday and arrive at her own property and begin her own independent life, and no one legally or morally could say a word against it. She stayed for supper. Nathaniel passed her the bread without being asked, the way people pass bread to someone who has been sitting at their table long enough for the habit to form. Emily showed her the new entry in the ledger, the East Quarter grain sale, which had come in 12% above the figure they'd projected, exactly as Emily had said it would when she'd caught Cal and Doss's conversation from 30 feet, and filed it away with the crow-sharp accuracy of someone who had been practicing this skill since before she had words for it. "I told you," Emily said. "You did," Sarah said. "I'm putting it in the record," Emily said. "That I told you." "It's already in the record," Sarah said. "It's your ledger." Emily looked satisfied in the way she looked satisfied, completely briefly, and then immediately on to the next thing. Mrs. Brooks served the stew and sat down at the corner of the table where she always sat, which was the corner that was technically the servant's position, but which had long since become simply where she sat, because Carter Manor had never quite managed the strict formalities that larger estates maintained, and Sarah suspected Nathaniel had never particularly wanted it to. It was a good supper. Plain food, honest company, the comfortable sounds of a household that had found its rhythm. Sarah looked around the table and felt the thing she'd been feeling for 2 weeks without letting herself name it. She named it now privately, where no one could see. Home. Then she picked up her spoon and ate her stew, because naming things was fine, but supper got cold if you sat looking at it. The letter from Fletcher arrived on Thursday. Fletcher was the cheese buyer from the first Millbrook market, the one who'd tried to undercut her on the first wheel and paid asking price when she didn't move. He had in the month since become one of her reliable buyers, the converted skeptic kind, who became more loyal than anyone who'd never doubted in the first place. His letter was brief and businesslike, and contained an offer that Sarah read 3 times before she set it down. She did the arithmetic. Then she did it again. Then she sat very still in the dairy for a moment and thought about what 30% above market rate for a 2-year contract meant for a woman who owned her own dairy lease and had a herd that was currently producing the best yields it had seen in half a decade. It meant she was no longer starting over. It meant she had arrived. She found Nathaniel in the study. She knocked 2 raps even and firm his pattern, which she had adopted without noticing, and pushed the door open when he said, "Come in." She set the letter on the desk in front of him without preamble. He read it, set it down, looked at her. 30% above market, he said. For 2 years, she said. Contracted, guaranteed. He was quiet. "I need to expand the herd," she said. 2 cows minimum to fulfill the contracted volume reliably, and I'll need to formalize the dairy lease agreement with the county to make the contract enforceable. Fletcher will want documentation of my standing as an independent operator. "You have the documentation," he said. "I filed it." "I know." She paused. "I need to go to the county clerk's office, sign the formal papers, put my name on the record properly." He held her gaze. "When do you want to go?" "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded. "I'll drive you." "You don't need to." "I'll drive you." he said again, and said it in the tone that wasn't a negotiation. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. She picked up the letter and went back to the dairy and stood at the work table and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full weight of what was happening, the size of it, what her father would have said, what it meant that the Whitmore name was going on a county record again this time, attached to something that could not be taken by bad debt or misplaced trust or any of the ordinary ways the world dismantled things people had built. 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back to Fletcher with her terms. 3 points she wanted adjusted in the proposed agreement. All of them, reasonable, all of them. Things Fletcher would accept because he was a practical man and the cheese was worth it. She signed it, Sarah Whitmore, Whitmore Dairy, at Carter Manor, Western Virginia. The first time she'd put that name on paper in that combination. It looked right. It looked, she thought, like a thing that had been waiting to exist. Chavag. The drive to the county clerk's office the next morning was quiet, in the way their silences had become not empty, but settled, the kind of quiet two people share when they've run out of things they need to say to fill space, and have arrived at the things they're still working out how to say. Halfway there, Nathaniel said, "My father built that dairy." She looked at him. "He built it the first year he owned the property," he said. "Before the main house was repaired, before the barn was expanded. He said a working dairy was proof of commitment to a piece of land, that you don't build a dairy if you're planning to leave." He looked at the road ahead. "He was right about that, I reckon." She thought about what he wasn't saying, about the 2 years the dairy had sat silent, about what that silence had cost him, not just financially. "You didn't abandon it," she said. "You just couldn't find the right person to bring it back." He was quiet for a moment. "I found her eventually," he said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but the corner of his mouth had done the thing it sometimes did not. Quite a smile, but the approach to one, the closest he usually got in daylight with witnesses. "You found her at your kitchen door in a split boot," she said. "Don't make it more elegant than it was." "It was plenty elegant," he said, "from where I was standing." She looked at the road ahead and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that which wouldn't either minimize it or make it into more than the moment required, and she had learned in 5 months of working alongside this particular man that his moments were best received at their actual size. They signed the papers at the county clerk's office, her signature on the dairy lease, his witnessing it, the clerk stamping it with the official seal and filing it in the record book with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man for whom this was a Tuesday morning's work, and not the thing it actually was. She looked at her name in the record book, at the ink still damp on the page. "All right," she said. To herself mostly. "All right," Nathaniel said quietly beside her. They drove home with the signed copy in her coat pocket, and the road was still quiet, and the Blue Ridge was doing its late October thing of going gold and red along the ridgeline, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it. Some things were large enough that talking about them only made them smaller. Emily proposed the name. She came to the dairy on Saturday morning with her ledger under one arm and a piece of paper in her hand that she set on the work table with the specific authority of someone presenting a conclusion they have reached through rigorous process. Sarah looked at the paper. "Whitmore and Carter Dairy," she read. "It's both," Emily said. "Your name and ours, because the dairy is yours, but it's on our land, and we're the ones who will be delivering the milk every morning, and I reckon both names should be on it." Sarah looked at the paper, at the girl who had written it out in her careful, precise hand with a border of small thistle designs around the edge, the same thistle that was carved into the old butter mold, the pattern Sarah had found in the storage shelf on the first day and had been using ever since. "Where did you get the thistle?" Sarah asked. "It's on the butter mold," Emily said. "It was my grandmother's. She brought it from Scotland when she came over." She paused. Uncle Nathaniel said it meant persistence, that thistles grow where nothing else will. Sarah looked at the paper for a long moment. "Whitmore and Carter Dairy," she said again. "Yes," Emily said, "unless you don't want Carter in it. I understand if you want it to just be yours." "I want both," Sarah said. Emily looked at her steadily. "You're going to marry him," she said. Not a question this time. The way she said things when she had gathered enough information to be certain. Emily. I'm not asking, Emily said. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I know and that I'm glad and that you don't have to be careful around me about it. She looked down at her ledger, then up. I've had enough careful. I'd rather have honest. Sarah looked at the 9-year-old sitting across from her with her crow-sharp eyes and her grandmother's thistle on a piece of paper, and her mother's voice encoded in the way she saw the world. You're going to be something remarkable, Sarah said, when you grow up. I'm already something remarkable, Emily said with complete seriousness. I just need more time to finish developing. Sarah laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and full, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded. Emily looked at her with the brief, pleased expression of someone who has successfully landed the thing they were aiming for, then went back to her ledger. Nathaniel asked her on a Sunday evening, not formally, no bended knee, no prepared speech, because that was not who he was, and she would not have wanted it if it had been. He found her in the dairy after supper, where she often was in the evenings, now updating the ledger, checking the aging wheels, doing the small maintenance that a working dairy required every day, regardless of what else was happening. He came in and sat on the stool in the corner. Emily's stool by custom, though Emily was inside doing her reading lesson and was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet before he said something that mattered. I've been thinking, he said. About what you said at the harvest gathering, he said. That nobody had asked you the right way before. She kept her pen moving. I remember. I've been thinking about what the right way would be, he said. Turns out it's harder than I expected to find the right words when you've spent 5 months watching someone do everything correctly. She stopped writing, looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and direct, the way he'd looked at her on that first morning at the kitchen door. The same quality of attention, the same absence of performance, the same commitment to saying what was true. I don't want you to stay because you owe this estate anything, he said. You don't. That ledger is in better shape than it's been in 6 years, and I reckon it'll stay that way whether you're here or not, because you've shown Cal and Doss and even Wick how it ought to be done, and they won't forget it. He paused. I don't want you to stay because Emily needs you. She does, but she's Emily Carter, and she will be fine regardless. She's been fine for 2 years on instinct, and she'll be fine on instinct, plus whatever you've taught her, and she'll be fine when she's 30 and managing her own operation and making her own arguments to county clerks. Sarah said nothing. I want you to stay, he said, because I have been a more honest man in the 5 months since you knocked on my kitchen door than I was in the 5 years before it. Because you argued with me about the bonus threshold on the day we met, and I knew then that you were the kind of person who would always tell me the true thing, even when it was inconvenient, and I have needed that kind of person for a long time without knowing how to ask for it. He held her gaze. Because this house is quieter when you're not in it, and I don't mean that in the sentimental way, I mean it in the way that matters. The thinking is flatter, the work is duller. The problems are harder when you're not there to look at them from the angle that makes them workable. He reached into his coat pocket. He set a small object on the work table between them. It was the butter mold, the old one with the thistle carved into it, the one that had belonged to his grandmother, that had been in the storage shelf when Sarah arrived and had been in use every day since. My grandmother used that mold for 40 years, he said. She said the thistle was because good things are stubborn things, that anything worth having puts down roots in hard ground and doesn't move. He looked at the mold, then at her. I'd like you to keep using it, permanently, in your dairy with your name on the lease on your terms. A pause. With mine alongside it if you'll have me. She looked at the mold, at his hands resting on his knees, still and patient, at his face which was fully open in the way it went when he had run out of management and was simply being what he was. She thought about a girl at a plur in a borrowed shawl, about a farm loaded onto a wagon, about 12 miles and a split boot and a kitchen door and the 3 words she hadn't expected. She thought about what her father had said, that good work was its own argument. She thought about what she'd added to that quietly over 5 months, that good work done alongside the right people was something else entirely. Something that didn't have a word yet, or if it did, she'd been too busy earning it to stop and name it. She thought about Emily's paper, the thistle border, both names on the sign. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "The proposal," she said. "I want it to be mine." He blinked. "I beg your pardon. You just told me why you want me to stay," she said. "That's not a proposal. That's a declaration." She held his gaze, and the corner of her mouth was doing the thing she'd learned from watching his corner of the mouth. Do it the approach to something the just before. A proposal involves a question. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face shifted the full weight of his composure, releasing into something that was unmistakably a smile. "Then ask it," he said. She stood up from the work table. She walked around to where he was sitting on the stool, and she stood in front of him and looked at him directly. The way she'd looked at him at the kitchen door on the first morning. No hedging, no performance. The full weight of what she meant behind what she said. "Nathaniel Carter," she said. "I came to your door with nothing but my father's training and my mother's recipe and a set of skills I wasn't sure anyone would value. You gave me a contract and a fair wage and the room to work without apology. You let me be exactly what I was, and it turned out that was exactly what was needed, and I have not been surprised by that, because I knew what I was worth, but I am grateful for it anyway, because knowing your worth and finding someone who agrees are two different things, and they don't always happen at the same time." She paused. "I would like to marry you, on the terms I've stated, with my name on my own lease, and my own standing in my own right alongside yours, and not because of it." She held out her hand. "Is that agreeable?" He looked at her hand, at her face, at the 5 months of everything between the kitchen door and this dairy in this October evening. "That," he said, "is more than agreeable." He took her hand, and that was that. No more words needed for the decision. Some things once made need only the making, not the explaining, not the elaborating, not the ceremony of language that people wrap around moments when they're not sure the moments can hold their own weight. This one could. They married in November, before the first real frost in the church at Millbrook, with the deacon who had nodded at the harvest gathering officiating, and Emily Carter standing beside Sarah in a dress that Mrs. Brooks had spent 2 weeks sewing and would not hear any thanks for. Cal and Doss and Wick sat in the third pew, and their presence said what they would never have put into words, that this was right, that the thing being made here was real, that they had watched it build from the ground up and knew the quality of the foundation. Margaret Hale came from Staunton with a gift for Emily, and a quiet word for Sarah that Sarah received without ceremony because Margaret had made her decision, and it had been a good one, and there was no need to make more of it than that. The butter mold sat on the dairy shelf. The thistle pressed into every round. The ledger showed a standing contract with Fletcher, a winter order from Millbrook, a 2-year supply agreement that had arrived 3 days after the wedding from a merchant in Staunton who had tasted the cheese at a dinner party and tracked down the source through pure commercial determination. The East Quarter grain had come in at 14% above projection, which was 2 points better than Emily had estimated, and Emily had added this to her ledger under a column she'd titled "Observations Confirmed," with the satisfaction of someone building a record of their own reliability. The debt to Aldrich was being paid on schedule against the timeline Sarah had drafted on a Thursday night by lamplight, and Aldrich had sent a brief letter in December acknowledging receipt of the first payment with a postscript that said simply, "The Carter estate appears to be in capable hands," which both of them understood was his version of a compliment. In the February of 1818, a girl arrived at the kitchen door of Carter Manor. She was perhaps 19, thin from a winter that had been hard, with the specific careful expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say many times and is still not sure it will be enough. She said she'd heard there was a dairy operation here that was hiring. She said she had some experience with cheese presses. She said her father had lost his farm the previous autumn, and she had no work, and she was not asking for charity, she was asking for a fair hearing. Mrs. Brooks opened the door and looked at her. Then she said, "Wait here," and went to find Sarah. Sarah came to the kitchen door and stood in the frame and looked at the girl at the worn boots and the rehearsed composure and the specific, exhausted dignity of someone who has decided that showing up is the only thing left worth doing. She did not need to think about it long. "Come inside," she said. Tell me what you know about cheese presses, and we'll talk about what's possible." The girl looked at the woman in the doorway, with the calloused hands, and the direct eyes, and the expression that was neither pity nor judgment, but was simply honest attention. "Yes, ma'am," the girl said, and stepped inside. Sarah closed the door behind her. In the dairy. The morning's first wheel was already in the press. The butter mold sat on the shelf thistle side, up the way her grandmother had kept it, because good things are stubborn things, and anything worth having grows in hard ground and doesn't move. Carter Manor was not quiet anymore. It was full of the sounds of work, and the sounds of people who had found their place in the world and were getting on with the business of living it, which is the only sound that matters in the end, and the best one. Sarah Whitmore Carter had come to a kitchen door with nothing but what she knew and what she was worth. It had been, as it turned out, exactly enough.